Good morning. My name is Janie Montblanc, and on behalf of the Great Basin Fire Science Delivery Team and partners, I would like to welcome you to this webinar, Effects of Imazapic Over 4 Years Post-Treatment, presented by Jean Schupp from Utah State University. I'm hearing a little bit reverb on myself, and I hope that no one else is hearing it, but luckily I'm not going to be the one talking that long. All right, before I introduce our speaker, I want to let you know that you may ask questions of the speaker or me at any time during the webinar by typing them into the questions pane of your control panel at the top right of your screen. I will keep questions for Gino in the queue and field them after the presentation. I will show up in your questions pane as the Wildland Fire Lessons Learned Center, but it's really me, Janie. I also want to let you know that whatever you do in your control panel does not affect the webinar presentation. So you are welcome to type a test message, test your audio, or just try out anything you want in your control panel, and it won't disrupt the webinar. Now I would like to introduce our presenter. Dr. Jean Schupp is a professor of plant population ecology and restoration ecology at Utah State University in Logan and is a member of the Sagebrush Steppe Treatment Evaluation Project team. Dr. Schupp's primary research focus is the critical seed and seedlings stages of plant establishment, which includes the ecology of seed production and dispersal, seed survival and germination, and seedling survival and growth. His goal is to contribute to the development of an understanding of plant population and ultimately community dynamics by understanding processes controlling quantitative and spatial patterns of plant recruitment. Welcome, Gino, and thank you for presenting today.
Thank you, and welcome to everybody.
All right, I am making you the presenter.
Okay, so does everybody see the PowerPoint at this point?
Not yet.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay, up and running.
Great.
So good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on the time zone you're in. This is a slightly different emphasis than originally planned, but not too much. We're going to be giving a 4-year post-treatment update of sage steppe, particularly the sagebrush cheatgrass network of sage steppe. With an emphasis on imazapic effects. Okay, so we're not going to talk just about imazapic, but that's going to be the primary focus of what I talk about today. So it's kind of an overview. I'm sure a lot of you have a good idea to a moderately good idea of sage steppe, but just to make sure everybody's on board, we'll have a brief overview of the network we're talking about. We have 20 sites within sage steppe, 7 within the sagebrush cheatgrass network, which is what we'll be talking about today, and 13 sites within the juniper encroachment network. And these circled sites, circled with black, are the sagebrush cheatgrass network. So they extend from down in northern, northwestern Utah, up through Idaho, northern Nevada, southeast Oregon to southeastern Washington. So it's a pretty broad geographic network. The sage steppe is, as most of you are aware, a multi-institution, multidisciplinary experimental study that's really focusing on fuels treatment effects in the endangered sagebrush ecosystem. And so when we're thinking about the effects, we're thinking very broadly. The effects on plants, fuels, birds, insects, soils, hydrology, economics, and even social interactions. So here today, what we're going to be concerned with is vegetation responses to fuels treatments. Okay? And again, that first 4 years post-treatment. And once again, the emphasis today is going to be responses to imazapic herbicide, but we'll be talking about some of the responses to other treatments as well. So the fuels treatments we applied in this sagebrush cheatgrass network at the whole plot level plots ranging in size from 75 to about 200 acres. We have control or unmanipulated plots. We have burn plots that had fall prescribed fire with a goal of 100% black. We have mechanically treated plots, okay, where we have mowing with an 8 to 12 inch mower height. Now the goal of this adjustable height is to attempt to mechanically reduce sagebrush cover by about 50%. And then we have a tebufiron treatment with 1.5 pounds per acre flown on with fixed wing. And the goal of this, selecting this level of 1.5 pounds per acre, is to try to reduce sagebrush cover by about 50% chemically. So both of these latter two treatments, we're trying to reduce sagebrush cover, not eliminate sagebrush by any means. And then across all of those whole plot treatments, we have at the subplot level of about 1/4 acre imazapic herbicide versus no imazapic herbicide subplots. And the application is 444 to 591 milliliters per hectare, depending on the litter encountered in that treatment. With more litter, higher rates, because the litter inhibits the movement of the herbicide to the ground and therefore its effectiveness. Now, imazapic, since that's the emphasis, make sure we all know what we're talking about. It's an herbicide that works as both pre-emergent and post-emergent activity. There's not a whole lot of research available at this point to support this, although we are getting more research all the time. The evidence to date suggests that it is more effective against annuals than it is against perennials. But it's also clear there's extensive variation among species in the response to imazapic, variation in both annuals and in perennials as to how sensitive they are to this herbicide. The primary hope of using imazapic is to reduce cheatgrass cover and the cover of other annual exotics. And the two major benefits that might come from that is reduced fine fuel loads and therefore reduce fire problems, and also releasing desirable perennials from competition from the cheatgrass and the other exotic annuals, so that the relic perennials can perhaps grow in size and vigor, and perhaps even open up space for recruitment of new desirable perennials. Just a quick look at some of the sites to get a feel for what we're looking at across this range. In Heart Mountain, Oregon, have two different sites that differ in soils and in vegetation. Moses Coulee in Washington is the furthest north, and it has the highest density of forbs. Saddle Mountain, also in Washington, is the lowest elevation site. And then there's an example of the Oahe site in northern Nevada while the prescribed fire is occurring. Now, across this broad geographic range, we have a lot of variability in these sagebrush, Wyoming big sagebrush systems. These 7 sites we have are spread across 6 different MLRAs, major land resource areas. The Anarchy site down here in Utah is on a calcareous substrate. All of the rest are on basalt. Okay, but even though you've got that common basalt bedrock, there's still a lot of differences in soil depth, texture, fertility, and other things. And of course, as you can imagine, across this gradient, we have a lot of variation in climate. Now, grazing has been excluded from all plots since the study started, but they all differ quite a bit in their grazing history, pre-experiment or pre-study. Just some examples: Oahe in northern Nevada had year-round cattle grazing. Roberts in southeastern Idaho had winter and spring sheep grazing. Heart Mountain sites are pronghorn refuge that have had livestock removed for quite some time. So they all have this different history, but none of them are being grazed presently. Okay, across the network we have sets of widespread species. Now, relative frequency by site is these first columns of numbers. Okay, so relative frequency is basically the percentage of subplots at that site that have the species. And then we have this column of indicator values. And the key here is the lower that number is, okay, the more evenly represented the species is across sites and across subplots within sites. So as we see, Wyoming big sagebrush, not surprisingly, since it's the focus of our ecosystem, is frequent across the network. It is found in every single subplot in every site. Other species that are widely distributed, Elamus elamoides or squirreltail, is very frequent in most of the sites, okay, but not so frequent in our two Washington sites. And then Poa secunda, again, quite frequent in most of the sites, okay, but considerably less frequent in Gray Buttes in Oregon and in Robertson, Idaho. And then we also have more localized species. For example, needle and threadgrass is found in Moses Coulee, Washington, and Roberts, Idaho at pretty high frequency and virtually absent from the other sites. Shad scale, interestingly, is moderately frequent at Oniki in Utah, absent from the other sites. And blue bunch wheatgrass is pretty frequent in our two Washington sites and virtually absent from our other sites. Okay. So we do have a lot of variation across this network that's all being analyzed together. Mean precipitation and elevation vary, and they are correlated with each other. Sandbird bluegrass frequency is negatively, or cover actually, is negatively correlated with precipitation and elevation. Cheatgrass is negatively correlated with sagebrush cover and soil carbon, interestingly. And analysis suggests there's strong biological and environmental overlap among the sites, but there are these distinctions. And one thing that stands out, vegetation, is the two Washington sites certainly are distinct in their squirreltail and blue bunch frequencies, with squirreltail being much less frequent than at the other sites and blue bunch being much more frequent than at the other sites. So our big question, if you want to look at it from the ground's eye view, did fuels treatments result in this, a jungle of happy fruiting cheatgrass, or result in something more like this, an absence or at least a low presence of these undesirable invasives? So let's look first at the biggest issue that we have in the ecosystem is Bromus tectorum. And across all treatments, Bromus or imazapic reduced cheatgrass cover. Okay, so in all of these figures, the first bars are going to be at year 0. Year 0 means it's before the treatments were applied. And then 1 year, 2 year, 3 years, and 4 years after the treatments were applied. Okay, so imazapic greatly reduced cheatgrass cover, and this reduction is significant through 4 years post-treatment, and at least in some of the sites is still going on 5 or 6 years later. So it's having a strong and relatively long-term impact, negative impact on cheatgrass cover. Okay. Interesting, you'll see this spike in cover in year 3 post-treatment in a number of the slides. It certainly is not going to be there with all the functional groups we look at, but it's fairly common. It's not straightforward completely why that is showing up, because it's not a single calendar year. The year of treatment, okay, that treatments were implemented varied across the network. We could not initiate all sites in the exact same year. So initiation is spread out over about 3 years. So this is not representing the same calendar year. It's representing 3 years post-treatment for each of the sites that were starting at different times. Okay. Now, if we look at the subplot level, one thing that stands out, and this isn't surprising to any of us who walk around out there, there's a lot of variation in cheatgrass cover, both within years, 0, 1, 2, etc., and within treatments. Imazapic is the I, no imazapic is the NI. Okay. So you see a lot of spread from very low cheatgrass cover to very high cheatgrass cover. But in all of these cases, in the post-treatment years, imazapic, highlighted with these red arrows, shifted the distribution to lower cover values. For example, here in year 4 post-treatment, you can see a shift of this distribution down to lower cover values. So with imazapic, you still can have plots with a moderately high cover of bromus. There's just a lot fewer of those subplots that have moderately high cheatgrass cover. Most of them are greatly reduced. So to summarize this key finding for this particularly important species, imazapic in our study reduced cheatgrass fuel loads and competition for at least 4 years. So this is potentially opening up a window for potentially seeding desirable species and also for the release of existing perennials for growth and reproduction. Okay. But what additional effects did imazapic have? We are dealing with an herbicide. Okay. It affects plants, and as we talked about earlier, it's thought to be especially effective against annuals, but the evidence we have to date suggests there's a lot of species-to-species variation of annuals and of perennials in sensitivity to imazapic. Okay, so what's happening to the rest of our sites? First, let's look at native annual forbs. There were no whole plot treatment effects or fire mowing, things like that. Okay. But imazapic reduced cover of these native annual forbs for 3 years post-treatment. By 4 years post-treatment, there was no significant effect. So it is having an impact on these native annual forbs. Now, if we restrict that group of native annual forbs to only the more uncommon species, and by uncommon, we're having to cut off that they're present in less than 10% of the subplots. So these might be perhaps of a special concern. Imazapic reduced the cover of these uncommon annual forbs for 2 years post-treatment, but by 3 years post-treatment, there's no significant effect. Okay, so imazapic is reducing cover of our native annual forbs, okay, both the common and the uncommon ones, but they are recovering to pre-treatment levels, or recovering to the cover found in the controls more rapidly than cheatgrass is, which the reduction in cover is not good, but the more rapid recovery is a good sign. Okay. Basically, we said that. Okay, how about the exotic annual forbs, something else that we wouldn't mind hammering pretty hard. Now, we do have some strong whole plot treatment effects here. And starting year 2 post-treatment, there was a steady increase in the cover of exotic annual forbs in the fire plots, okay, which we see starting to show a difference here at year 2 and continuing to increase through years 3 and 4. And at 4 years post-treatment, both the tebuthyron and the mow plots also had greater cover of exotic forbs, annual forbs, than did the control plots. Okay, so all of these whole plot treatments, the fire, the tebuthyron, and the mechanical, okay, are at some point post-treatment, okay, increasing, leading to an increase in the cover of these exotic annual forbs, which is not necessarily what we want to be seeing. Okay. Now, the imazapic effect, okay, imazapic reduced cover for 3 years post-treatment. By year 4 post-treatment, there's no difference in cover between imazapic and no imazapic. but it seems to be to some extent just because of the very high variation among subplots in cover with both imazapic and no imazapic. The difference between the mean in year 4, the means in year 4 is not really different than the difference in the means in year 3. Okay, but because of the high variation, it's not significant in year 4. But at least for 3 years post-treatment, imazapic is significantly and greatly reducing the cover of exotic annual forbs, which is good. Perennial forbs, there was an imazapic by year interaction that was significant, but there's no evidence of an imazapic effect in a year post-treatment. Okay. So how about perennial grasses? This is something that we want to benefit, to respond positively to the reduction in exotic annual grasses and annual forbs. First, if we look, okay, let me clarify something a little bit. When we're talking about the perennial grasses, we view 2 different groups of perennial grasses. They're a little different from each other. We have what we call the perennial tall grasses, which are the larger, more deep-rooted perennial grasses in the systems. And then we have, by itself, Polycicunda or sandberg bluegrass. Now, it's a little bit shorter, it's more shallow-rooted, has a more fibrous root system, and tends to start growing earlier. So it's behaving a little different from the others. So we look at the perennial tall grasses. Fire reduced cover of them 1 year post-treatment, but by 2 years post-treatment, cover had recovered to be the same as all of the other treatments. And by 4 years post-treatment, cover was greater in all of our fuels treatment plots than in the control plot. So these treatment plots 4 years post-treatment had led to greater cover of exotic annuals, which was not viewed as very good, but very encouragingly, by 4 years post-treatment, all of those treatments are leading to greater cover of these desirable perennial tall grasses. So that's a positive. If you look at the imazapic effect, it reduced cover across all of the post-treatment years. So we're only showing imazapic versus no imazapic here. And yes, the evidence tends to suggest that annuals are particularly susceptible to imazapic, but this group of grasses, a group of species of perennial tall grasses, are pretty strongly negatively affected as far as cover by this imazapic herbicide treatment. Now, if we look at the other perennial grass group, the single species Polycicunda, fire reduced cover dramatically and throughout the post-treatment period. So the tall grasses recovered by 2 years post-treatment, and by 4 years post-treatment, we're doing even better than in the control. Polycicunda's cover is reduced by fire over the long term. Okay. Now, mowing in this figure appears to increase cover, but this is not really a significant increase. Okay. But it certainly is trending towards increasing cover of Polycicunda. The imazapic effect on Polycicunda reduced cover for 3 years post-treatment. Okay. By year 4, cover had recovered. Okay, so there is recovery. Again, the recovery of Polycicunda is more rapid than the recovery of cheatgrass, which was still significantly depressed after 4 years post-treatment and ongoing. But we do have a significant reduction, a significant negative impact on POA for the first 3 years post-treatment. And then the last analysis of this type, the last functional group we want to look at is sage-grouse plants. So it should be a particular concern to a lot of people listening today. And imazapic reduced cover of these sage-grouse plants in years 2 and 3 post-treatment, not 1 year post-treatment, and the effect was gone by 4 years post-treatment, but for a 2-year period, a reduction in the cover of these could be important plants. Just as a little caveat, consider this as a teaser in a sense. It's a very preliminary result because at this point, we're not completely certain of the quality of the list we're using. We're still working with a lot of people to try to get a more refined and more reliable list of important sage-grouse plants versus not. Okay. So another way of looking at our data is let's think about what explains cheatgrass cover in this system. Now, first thing is going to have to be explaining these vector curves or these figures. So what we're going to be doing now is look at a series of slides based on this particular figure. And for the y-axis, we have the percent cover of cheatgrass 3 years post-treatment. And on the x-axis, this is the function of the pre-treatment cover of perennial grasses, all of the perennial grasses, the tall perennial grasses and Poa secunda. Okay, what we see is there's a whole lot of variation across these subplots in the network in pre-treatment perennial grass cover, and a whole lot of variation that we see in cheatgrass cover 3 years post-treatment. Now the curves in these figures, think of these as somewhat like regressions, okay, but they're doing something a little different. The red line, for example, goes through we can call it the edge of the distribution. It's basically dividing 5% of the subplots have the higher values from the 95% that have lower values. So it's kind of defining the edge of this distribution. The blue goes through the third quartile. This is that 25% of our subplots are above the curve, 75% are below. And then this green line, the lower one, goes through the median with 50% above and 50% below. With all three of these curves, whether it's the 95%, 75%, or the median, you get a fairly similar story. Once you get above about 10 to 12% of initial perennial grass cover, as we increase cover of perennial grasses, we get a steady decline in cover of cheatgrass 3 years post-treatment. Okay? This is kind of what we've thought all along. This is not a completely unusual result in and of itself, but there are some interesting things that come out of this. If you think about it, this is really mostly affecting some sort of upper limit of cheatgrass cover. Okay? If you look at any given perennial grass cover value, you actually can find a large range of cheatgrass cover from virtually 0 to the limit, okay, for those conditions. So just because you have low perennial grass cover does not mean you're going to have a lot of cheatgrass. You can have a lot, you can have a moderate amount, you can have a small amount. So at low perennial grass cover, there's a very wide range of possible cheatgrass cover values, okay, from virtually 0 up to some pretty high, okay, up around 70 to 80% cover. And at higher perennial grass cover, there is still a range of possible outcomes, okay, but it's narrowed, not because of a change at the lower end, but because you cannot get the really high levels of cheatgrass cover. So again, this perennial grass cover seems to be setting a limit as to how much cover you can possibly get rather than affecting the absolute amount that you're going to get. Other things are obviously involved in determining the exact cover you get at that site. Now, interestingly, based on these curves, below about 10% perennial grass cover, there seems to be something else that's limiting plant cover, not just cheatgrass cover. You actually get all of these coming down towards the origin. What you're seeing is you're getting more plots with both low perennial grass cover and low cheatgrass cover than expected. Okay, something is going on with these plots that we haven't completely teased out yet. And if you look at the same approach with imazapic, you're going to get the same patterns that we just described in the no imazapic plots, but a lower cheatgrass cover shows up at any given perennial grass cover. Okay, you still can get subplots with imazapic that have moderately high cheatgrass cover, subplots with virtually no cheatgrass cover at the same perennial density, but the high levels, that upper limit, are much lower than the high levels we find at that same perennial grass cover without imazapic. So basically, imazapic is just squashing these curves down. So summary of what I've talked about up to this point, we think about the whole treatment plot effects, the prescribed fire, the tebufiron, the mowing. We don't really have much in the way of effects on cheatgrass cover or on native forb cover. Fire increased exotic annual forb cover in years 2 through 4 post-treatment. Tebufiron and mowing increased exotic annual forb cover in year 4 post-treatment. So these are some moderately negative consequences of these treatments. We don't want these exotic annual forbs to be increasing in density. Fire reduced tall perennial grass cover initially, but the cover recovered within 1 year. By 3 years post-treatment, tall perennial grass cover is greater in fire than in control plots. And by the next year, that 4th year post-treatment, also both tebufiron and mow plots had greater tall perennial grass cover than the control plots. So these treatments are leading to an increase in cover of exotic annual forbs, but very positively, they're also leading to an increase in these desirable perennial native grasses that are in the sites. In contrast to the tall perennial grasses, fire reduced polycyclone cover for at least 30 years post-treatment. We did have recovery in the 4th year, but even after 4 years, we're not seeing that positive response that we saw in tall perennial grasses. They actually had increased cover relative to the controls. If we think about the imazapic results, summarize those. First with cheatgrass, imazapic greatly reduced cheatgrass cover, and the effect lasted at least 4 years post-treatment and is still going on, at least in some of the sites. If we look at the forbs, the native annual forb cover was reduced for 3 years post-treatment. The subset of those native annual forbs that are uncommon had cover reduced for 2 years post-treatment, and exotic annual forb cover reduced for 3 years post-treatment. So all of these forbs, all these annual forbs, whether native or exotic, were harmed by imazapic, but all of them recovered more rapidly than cheatgrass cover did. And we saw no effect on perennial forb cover. If we look at the perennial grasses, imazapic reduced perennial tall grass cover throughout and sandblower bluegrass cover for at least 3 years post-treatment. This is not what we wanted to see. So if we look at the preliminary conclusions of what we have at this point, imazapic reduced cover of cheatgrass and exotic annual forbs for at least 4 years and 3 years respectively. Okay, this is good, but it also reduced cover of native annual forbs and native perennial grasses. But the native annual forbs and sandblower bluegrass did recover more rapidly than cheatgrass did. Okay. So this shows us that although imazapic opened up this potential window, this window of greatly reduced cheatgrass cover, okay, the negative effects, the direct negative effects of the herbicide on the desirable herbaceous species really didn't allow the perennials to take advantage of that window of reduced competition. Okay. Now, in 4 years, with tebuthyrin and mow, or even less with fire, the fuels treatments did result in increases in perennial grass cover, which is a big positive. They also led to increases in exotic forb cover, which is negative, but in my view, personally, the positive of increased perennial grass cover is stronger than the negative of increased exotic forb cover in this situation. Now, I want to conclude pretty shortly by just having a look at kind of a case study of what happens at Roberts, Idaho, that really shows some interesting results associated with imazapic. Okay. We did have a very strong imazapic effect at Roberts' site. So this is a no imazapic plot in 2009, the year post-treatment. And this was a great, as you can see, just looking at this sign, a great tumble mustard year. It's just beautiful stands, right? Exact same year, exact same site, but this is an imazapic treated plot the year before. Again, surrounded by lots of tumble mustard all through the untreated area, and nothing, okay, no annuals in our imazapic plot. Very strong imazapic effect. You can see native perennial grasses still in here, a few sagebrush. There's not a lot of sagebrush at this site, okay, but you have a lot of bare ground because you're just not getting the emergence of an establishment of those annuals. Then along came the Jefferson fire. Started down here outside of the Idaho Nuclear Technology and Engineering Center and burned to the northwest, strongly driven by winds. In fact, it was spreading very rapidly. More than 100,000 acres burned, mostly in only about 8 hours. It led to closure of Interstate 15 repeatedly for a long time afterwards because of blowing dust. And it just so happened to burn right across our Roberts site, which is up here. And it burned most of our plots. Okay. The treatments we applied, the prescribed burn we applied was not very effective. The year that it was implemented, there was not a lot of good vegetative cover, herbaceous cover, didn't get a real good burn. The wildfire, on the other hand, had a very good burn when it came through. Now, interestingly, this is a picture we've already seen. I don't have a picture to show this, but it turned out that at least several of the imazapic plots did not burn in that Jefferson fire due to a lack of fuels, which you can imagine. This is that figure we saw of a imazapic plot before. There's just nothing there to carry the fire through, so the fire just went around and kept going. Okay. And then if you look at 2011, a year after the Jefferson fire, both of these are in burn plots that were doubly burned. If you look at no plateau or no imazapic plots, this is what they look like, completely filled with cheatgrass. If you looked at the imazapic or the plateau plots after that Jefferson fire, this is what they looked like. Okay, you see a lot of squirrel tail in here. There's some other perennial grasses, not a whole lot of vegetative cover, but very little in the way of those exotic annuals, okay, 2 years later. So the fire really increased cheatgrass in the absence of imazapic, but the long-term impacts of imazapic are keeping cheatgrass from responding to that fire in the treated plots. So an acknowledgement, first I just want to point out, I don't have this on the slide, I'm giving this presentation because I was asked to. This is not my work. This is the joint work of a lot of people that have been involved in the design and implementation of these experimental treatments, and a lot of people have been involved in the actual gathering of the data on these yearly resurveys of the treatment plots. But we also want to acknowledge Joint Fire Science Program for the bulk of the funding for this long-term project, Bureau of Land Management, especially the Salt Lake, Elko, Winnemucca, and Idaho Falls districts that allowed us to use their land and agreed to implement the treatments that we wanted. Very helpful in this work. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, especially the Mid-Columbia River National Wildlife Refuges and Heart Mountain National Antelope Refuge, allowed us to use their sites and implemented them, the treatments. And Nature Conservancy for one of our sites. The U.S. Geological Survey and the National Interagency Fire Center have all been important contributors to this project. For any more information, please go to the SageStaff website and the Great Basin Fire Science Delivery website, and you can find a lot more information. I understand that this webinar is being taped and will be available on the Fire Science, well, actually it should be available on both of these websites to look at in the future, send your coworkers to, send any interested people to. And there will also be a PDF of this slideshow available after this as well. And with that, I'll be very happy to try to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. All right, I'll field questions now. The first question is from Bob Gillespie. He asks, was dilution of imazapic examined for effectiveness on high litter conditions? For example, more water to get through the litter.
No, we did not do anything that detailed. When this was set up, keep in mind this was before the national NEPA on herbicide use, and we basically were working with a restriction of, I think it was no more than 10, maybe 15 acres per district per year could be treated with imazapic as an experimental basis. Okay? So we did not try to, and that's one reason it's applied at a subplot level than at a whole plot level. Okay? We're limited in the amount of ground we can treat. So we didn't try to develop any complex experimental test of range of densities, range of dilution, range of application rates and things like that. But we simply looked at moderately typical usages that have been in the literature that have shown effects, and we assumed that the mow treatment was going to have the most litter on the ground, so we put the most on that. The fire treatment would have the least litter on the ground, we put the least on that, and then tebufiron and control were intermediate. But we didn't experiment with variation in that. But across all of those treatments, we're getting the exact same results. So our seat of the pants guesses seem to have given us some pretty similar levels of effectiveness of the treatment. Because the imazapic was applied to all four of those whole treatment plots, the control, the fire, the mow, and the tebufiron, and you're getting control in all four of those conditions.
Great, thank you. Allison Dean asks, has this study been published yet? What is the citation? Where can I find it?
Stay tuned. I presented this because we are at this moment working up a manuscript that's going to be presenting these results. We're working on it here at Utah State University. As soon as we have a first draft of that, it will be distributed to the broader range of co-authors of this paper in the SageStep network. and then we'll see what happens. But yeah, we're hoping to get this out as soon as possible. Some of the highlights of this are actually a general overview is given in the last Sage Step newsletter that is posted on the Sage Step website. But the more robust analyses are in the process right now.
Great, thanks. Allison also asks, were the herbicides applied after burning, or was fire not part of the herbicide treatment?
The imazapic herbicide was crossed with all 4 of the whole treatment plots. So we had both imazapic and non-imazapic subplots in control plots, in fire plots, in mow plots, and in tebufiron plots. Okay, but in all cases, the first thing, because it's going to be the trickiest to implement, the first treatment that was applied was the prescribed fire in late summer, early fall. Okay, if we got the prescribed fire in, then the other treatments were applied. So imazapic was applied to fire plots, but it was applied after the fire was implemented.
Great, thank you. That looks like the last question so far. We'll see if...
It was crystal clear?
I guess so.
Or did people pass out?
I don't think they did. I think it was great. I just want to let everyone know that after the webinar closes, a 3-question survey will appear, and we would greatly appreciate it if you would take that little survey. I want to let you know that a recording of this webinar will be sent to you automatically through the GoToWebinar system tomorrow, and I will also post it to our website, the Great Basin Fire Science Delivery website, this week, along with a PowerPoint presentation. If you have more questions regarding this webinar or have requests for future webinars, please email or call me anytime. I still don't see any further questions, so with that, I'd like to thank you all for your participation today, and thank you, Gino, for your presentation.
My pleasure. We want to get this information out.
Great. All right, well, have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thank you.
All right, bye.